Okay, so now we can start on set of new features like so previously we were working on the locomotion stuff. Now I think we have pretty much stable setup for our locomotions. They can be having minor bugs, minor issues. We can resolve those stuff later on. But for now, I think we have a quite nice setup considering our motion system, right? So now I'm sort of thinking about implementing weapon system on top of our existing implementation and see how we can trigger the existing locomotion features based on specific weapons, right? For example, like right now our character is not carrying any sort of weapon, so character's anim set is in the unarmed state. But for example, let's say if we select a pistol, then the character's anim set should change to pistol state, and the relevant animation should be driven uh, within our existing locomotion system, right? Okay, so to start the implementation, I think I'm going to follow our component based architecture, like a pluggable architecture. So for the subsystems we have currently the locomotion system, which drive all the locomotion related core logic for our characters. Similarly, we can use weapon system the component to hold the context of our weapon related features for each character. Right. So I'll create a new blueprint the component and I'll name it as PPC weapon system. Okay. And then this can be used to plug to our characters. So I'll go to the characters blueprint base, BP character base, and let's add that actor component, PPC weapon system, right? Okay. And then I need a way to store several types of weapons inside this weapon system. And when the player input has been given, I should be able to trigger that specific weapon, right? So to do that, we can create a separate blueprint for our weapons. Like our characters, we have separate blueprints. Similarly, since this is a different context, we can have a different blueprint to drive that specific implementations. Right. So I'll create a new folder called weapons, and inside weapons, I will create a new folder called blueprints. And inside there, I will create another folder called base, like, and there I'll create a new actor blueprint called BP weapon base. Okay. So this would be act as the parent base class for all our weapons, and later on actually we can implement child instances based on this specific weapon base class. Right. Since we have the weapon base, I think we can configure certain set of stuff as well, like pre-configured settings and data. Yeah, so I'll create a new data structure for that, right? So inside our data, inside our structs, currently we have set of locomotion specific data structures. So similarly, I'll create another folder for our weapons, and there I'll store all the weapon related data structures, right? So maybe I'll rename this as weapon, right? nice to have sort of a singular form of naming convention when it comes to these data structure organizations. Right. So there I will create a new blueprint structure. I'll name it as BP weapon config. Right. So this weapon config will be used at the weapon base, and later on when we are going to encapsulate or extend its features, we can add much more different configurations. But for now, let's use this weapon config, right? And I'll specify several common configurations for each weapon, right? Because this weapon base will be act as the parent class for each of these different weapons, right? So the first I need weapon name, right? Weapon name, it should be name, and I can have a weapon icon as well. So later on, actually, we are going to implement HUD interface as a UI. So in that UI, we can use a weapon icon to show what sort of weapon that we are currently holding. Yeah, this should be texture 2D, right? And the weapon can be either static mesh or skeletal mesh. So I don't know what sort of a weapon that I'm going to hold. Therefore, I will create two different fields for static mesh and skeletal mesh, but at a specific blueprint, one of it will be used, right? For example, like a weapon like rifle, it could be a skeletal mesh, and a weapon like knife or a sword could be a static mesh, right? So that's the logic. So in order to specify that specific mesh, I'll create a static mesh for these static meshes, and its type should be static mesh. Right. And then we can have skeletal mesh. Type should be skeletal mesh. Right. And this weapon should be able to attach for a specific socket at our character blueprint. Actually, the character skeleton. So I'll add another field to specify that as well, and I'll call it as attach socket, and it should be the type of name. Right. Okay. I think for now these fields would be enough, but later on actually multiple different fields will be added. But I think these 5 will be enough for as our initial steps. Right, now I go to weapon base, and over there I'll create a variable called weapon config, and this should be a type of weapon config, and it should be instant editable, which is a public variable, and as the category I'll assign it to setup. Okay, right. So now what we can do is we can go to our weapon system, and we can create another variable to hold what sort of default weapons that I'm going to have in our character blueprint. So I'll create a new variable called default weapons, and this should be a type of actor, but I'll use the actor class reference, right? So in the actor class reference is different from actor object reference, because in a class actually we can instantiate a specific actor, but if you are going to use an object reference, we can't instantiate an actor based on that, right? Because it has been already spawned. So this is sort of a reference, or this is sort of like a spawned object of this specific class, but this class is sort of like a blueprint that we can use to spawn any number of objects, instances, right? So let's use this class reference, and this should be array, right? Because a given character can hold multiple different weapons. Therefore, I think it should be a array, and it should be instant editable. And as the category, I'll assign it for set. Okay. Right. Now, as the first step, this should be fine. So I'll go to my weapon blueprint base, and I'll just for testing, I will add a child blueprint class called weapon base test1. So this is our first weapon, and as the weapon config, I will name it as test1, and I'll duplicate this thing and BP weapon base test2. Actually, I don't need it to call it as weapon base, because these are just instances of our base weapon. And for this one, the weapon config, I'll name it as test2 as its weapon name. Right. And in our character base, I'll go for a player character, and here you can see we have weapon system already inherited, because we have initialized, or we have attached that actor component at a parent class. So the player base is a instance or child class of this parent class. Therefore, by default, we inherit that specific actor component as well, right? So if you click this weapon system actor component, now you can see we have a field called default weapons, where we can use to attach a set of default weapons, right? For just for testing, I will assign these two weapons, right? And I think I can move this outside of this base directory. Right. Now I'll assign this one and this one. Right, so you can see our first weapon is test1 and second weapon is test2, right? Okay. Now, I should be able to spawn that specific weapon at begin play, right? Therefore, I'll go to weapon system again, and by default, I think one character may hold a specific weapon only, which means we can define a default slot as well, right? Which means like which weapon that I'm going to use at the begin play, right? It could be the first weapon, it could be the second weapon, something like that. So for that, I will create a new variable called default weapon slot. This should be a type of integer, because I'm going to use indexes to specify which weapon that I'm going to use initially, and this should be a single instance, and I'll make it instant editable as well. Right. So now if you go to the BP player base, here we have default weapon slot as well, right? So if I set it as 0, then by default it will pick BP weapon test1, and if I make it as 1, then it will pick BP weapon test 2, right? Okay, so if I play it now, it won't do anything because I haven't added any sort of logic for weapon system to drive these sort of selections. So let's quickly add that as well, then we can do some playtest. Right, so if I go to weapon BPC weapon system instance, currently it doesn't have any sort of functions that has been called at the begin play. So first I think we need to be aware of what's our owner, right? Which means what is the actor blueprint that has been implemented or that has been attached this specific actor component, right? So in order to resolve that, actually we have a function called getOwner. So this will basically return whatever the parent actor that has been attached this component, and I'll promote it to a variable called owner. Right, and most of the time we are going to use this VPC weapon system in character blueprint. Therefore I will cast to character as well, so I can keep its reference here. Character. Okay, now I'll create not a macro actually. I'll create a new function called initialize, right? And this function would be called at the begin play to initialize our weapon system. And I'll go inside that function and let's implement the logics that require to spawn default weapons, right? So first we are going to use this default weapon actor array. So this is a class of class of actors array. So I can simply go to a for each loop, and then I can spawn actor from class. So this is the reason actually we used actor class reference instead of object instance, because we can spawn any number of actors based on that specific class reference. Okay. And as the spawn transform, I will split the pins, so these will be used as default transforms. And if I expand this node, you can see there is a node called owner, right? Which means who are the actor that is going to hold this specific spawned weapon. So ideally this should be the owner, right? It could be a player, it could be NPC, or it could be any sort of a character. Therefore the owner should be the owner, something like this, right? And then what we can do is, since I spawned these weapons, I can keep an array of weapon references, right? So later on we can use that array to toggle in between multiple different weapons. So to do that, I will create a new variable called weapons or weapon slots, and this should be the type of actor object reference, and it should be an array. Okay. So in order to populate or in order to add elements to this specific array, I'll create another function called add weapon, and inside that add weapon, let's call this array, and I'll add to it. And as the input, I can give whatever the new weapon that I'm going to add, right? and I'll call it as weapon. Right? And I don't need to, currently I don't need to add the same weapon instance again and again. Therefore, I can have sort of a check here. So I can simply check if this weapon is already in the list. If this instance is already in the list, then this should return a positive value, which means that specific index that exists within the array. So I can check whether this one is -1 or not. If it is -1, which means that this specific instance is not exist on the array. Otherwise, this one would be a positive value. So if this is -1, then we can safely add that instance to our array. So I think I can use this same node to here as well. So it will be much more organized. And I'll add a comment to here. Is weapon already exist? If not, I'll add to the array. Right. And inside initialize function, now I can call this function. I can pass this return value to it. Okay. And then this array should be called at least if we have one instance to be spawned, right? So currently you can see the default values is empty, so no need to go through a for each loop because we have nothing to be spawned. But if you go to the player base, actually, since we have configured those stuff, we have two elements, right? So since we have two elements, we can spawn the weapons by going through this for each loop. Therefore, I can have another check here, and let's check is empty. Right? Actually, we can check for is not empty, right? If it is not empty, then we are good to go, and we can spawn weapons. Right? And I'll comment this as if have at least, if we have at least one weapon to be spawned. Right. And each time when I'm initializing this function, I need to clear these weapon slots because sometimes this may have some dead references that has been already initialized. Therefore, for safe side, we can clear the previous references just for safeguarding our instances. Okay. Right. Now, after adding all the weapons, then we can finally pick whatever the weapon that I'm going to choose by using this specific default slot. Right. So how can I do that? Yeah, so for now, I will create a function called use weapon, and this weapon instant basically use weapon function basically get the slot as input, which is an integer, which means what index that I'm going to point inside or within this specific weapon slot array, right? So then I can get an instance by pointing this index, and I'll promote this to a local variable called maybe L weapon. So this is the weapon that I been already chosen, right? But I need to first check whether this one is valid or not, because let's say if I'm pointing to invalid index over here, this should return an invalid reference. Therefore I have to check whether we have a valid reference or not. So if we have a valid reference, which means we are good to go, which means we have a weapon, right? And yeah, so just for testing, I will print whatever the weapon that I am being chosen over here. Then I can see whether it's working properly or not, right? Later on, actually, we can further improve this function, but for now, this would be fine, right? And at the initialize function, once all the actor instance has been spawned, we can call this use weapon function, right? And I can pass this default weapon slot. Okay. And make sure at the beginning play you have called this function as well. Compile and save all. And let's play now. You can see it prints test2 weapon actually. So since this is too quick, maybe I can increase the duration for 10 maybe, and I'll add a red color, right? So if I go to the player base, you can see at the weapon system, as the default weapon slot, I am pointing for the first index. First index means this one, which is BP weapon test2. So it prints BP weapon test2 as our default weapon. If I choose 0, it will print default weapon test1 instance. And if I select any sort of invalid index, for example, like say 3, then we don't have an instance that has been referenced for this specific slot at our weapons list. Therefore, it may not print anything, right? Because we don't have any sort of a reference, right? So I will keep it as 0 for now. And yeah, so as the initial steps, I think this one would be fine. Now we have sort of a weapon system, a pluggable component at our player base, and we have the capability to choose whatever the instance we want, right? Okay, so in the next tutorial, maybe let's look at how we can actually choose, or how we can actually equip a weapon while we are unequipping the previous weapon. Okay, so thank you. I'll see you there.